In the year 1258, the smartest city on earth burned for 7 straight days. Baghdad, the capital of the Islamic world, home to more books than anywhere else on the planet, was about to have its entire library dumped into a river. Not metaphorically, literally. Witnesses said the Tigris ran black with ink and then red with blood, for so long that people claimed you could smell the city burning from a full day's ride away. And the man responsible wasn't some random warlord passing through looking for loot. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he brought an army engineered for exactly this kind of job. This is the story of how the greatest city in the medieval world got wiped off the map in under 2 weeks, because one man refused to believe he could possibly lose. Stick around, because the ending involves a rolled-up carpet, and it is not a happy one for the guy inside it. Let's rewind. To understand how far Baghdad fell, you first need to understand how impossibly high it was sitting. For roughly 500 years, Baghdad wasn't just a city. It was the operating system of the medieval world. This was the Islamic Golden Age, and Baghdad sat at its exact center. At the heart of it all was the House of Wisdom, and that name was not just marketing. It was a real library, translation center, and research academy, all under one roof. Scholars there translated Greek philosophy that most of Europe had genuinely forgotten existed. Mathematicians developed algebra, and yes, the word literally comes from a book written in this very city by a scholar named Al-Khwarizmi, whose own name eventually gave us the word algorithm. Astronomers mapped the night sky with instruments centuries ahead of their time. Doctors ran public hospitals with actual medical training, actual ethics boards, and actual routine bathing, while parts of medieval Europe were still nervously debating whether bathing was dangerous to your health. Baghdad had paper mills, so books could finally be mass-produced instead of copied out by hand, one exhausting page at a time. It had a functioning postal system stretching across the empire. Merchants and scholars poured in from China, from Spain, from East Africa, from India, all drawn to one round city built specifically to be the center of the world. And sitting at the very top of this entire operation was the Caliph, spiritual and political head of the Abbasid dynasty, a bloodline that had ruled for 500 years and, frankly, had started to believe its own legend a little too much. Baghdad wasn't just wealthy. Baghdad was convinced it was permanent. That belief was about to get extremely, catastrophically expensive. Now, let's introduce the man about to test that theory personally. His name was Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, brother of Kublai, the man about to run all of China, and personally handed a job by his other brother, the great Khan Monka, head west and fold everything between the Mongol heartland and Egypt into the empire, permanently. This was not a smash-and-grab raid dressed up as a war. Hulagu marched out with Chinese siege engineers, an army some estimates put well past 100,000 strong, and a reputation that tended to arrive in a city a few days before he did. Before Baghdad was even on the itinerary, Hulagu had a warm-up act. The Assassins, officially the Nizari Ismailis, were a secretive sect that had terrorized rulers across the entire region for over a century, operating from a mountain fortress at Alamut, so remote and so well defended that people genuinely believed it could never fall. Kings paid them off rather than risk a knife in the dark. Hulagu didn't negotiate. He simply surrounded the mountain, brought in his siege engineers, and methodically broke a reputation that had stood for 150 years in a matter of weeks. Riding somewhere in that campaign, oddly enough, was a brilliant Persian astronomer named Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who some accounts say advised Hulagu directly and later helped design one of the era's great observatories under Mongol patronage. Knowledge and conquest, quite literally riding side by side. Which is a strange, uncomfortable detail to sit with once you know exactly what's coming next for Baghdad's own scholars. So when Hulagu's messengers finally rode toward the city, this wasn't a polite diplomatic note. It was a countdown, dressed up as a letter. Meanwhile, inside Baghdad, the politics were, to put it gently, falling apart on their own. The Caliph, Al-Musta'sim, was not exactly remembered as a sharp strategic mind, even by his own contemporaries. His court was split by rivalry, most notably between his powerful vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, and the head of the military command. Some historical accounts, though genuinely disputed by modern historians, claim the vizier quietly hollowed out the army's funding in the years leading up to the siege, whether from political spite, plain financial mismanagement, or actual sympathy toward the approaching Mongols. Whatever the real cause actually was, the numbers were brutal by the time it mattered. Baghdad's standing military, once large enough to intimidate the entire region on reputation alone, had reportedly been allowed to shrink dramatically. This was not a city bracing for war. This was a city that genuinely, comfortably believed war would simply never reach its gates, because it never had before. Zoom out for a second and look at the wider board. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. Further west, Crusader states still clung to strips of the Levantine coast. Down in Egypt, a new power was quietly rising, a slave soldier class called the Mamluks, who nobody was paying much attention to yet, but who would matter enormously in just a few years. The Mongol Empire, meanwhile, stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the edge of Eastern Europe, the largest contiguous land empire humanity had ever built, and it was still expanding. Baghdad, in other words, wasn't being threatened by some regional rival. It was standing directly in the path of the single largest military machine on the planet, and it didn't seem to fully grasp that yet. Picture an ordinary morning in Baghdad, weeks before any of this. Merchants setting up stalls along the river, the smell of fresh bread and spice markets drifting through narrow streets, students crossing bridges toward the House of Wisdom with satchels of borrowed manuscripts, boats loaded with silk and paper drifting along the Tigris. Nobody in that crowd is thinking about siege engines. Why would they? This city hadn't fallen in 500 years. They probably felt about as realistic as the sky falling. That's what makes the next part hit so hard. Ordinary people living ordinary lives with absolutely no idea that the countdown had already started somewhere out past the horizon. So here's where it gets almost unbelievable, even by medieval standards. Hulagu sent the Caliph a very direct offer. No riddles, no ambiguity. Surrender, tear down the outer walls, pay tribute, and Baghdad lives. Refuse, and Hulagu promised the kind of ending you don't come back from. Now, if you're the Caliph sitting on that throne, you really have two options. Option 1. You look at what this exact same army just did to the supposedly unbreakable assassin fortress, and you take the deal on the table. Option 2, you assume God is personally about to intervene on your behalf because you're the Caliph and surely nothing bad ever happens to the Caliph. Al-Musta'sim picked option 2 with total, unshaken confidence. His advisors reportedly warned him repeatedly that this was suicide. His own vizier allegedly urged him toward negotiation instead of defiance. The Caliph brushed it all off anyway. He reportedly told Hulagu's messengers that if he simply commanded it, Every Muslim from India to Morocco would rise up as one and destroy the invaders in his defense. He didn't send an army back with them. He sent an insult. And Hulagu Khan was, by every account we have, not a man you wanted to insult. So Hulagu did exactly what Mongol armies did best. He moved, fast, and from multiple directions at once. Separate columns converged on Baghdad from the north and the south simultaneously, cutting off every possible escape route before the city had even finished arguing internally about whether this was actually serious. This wasn't a horde charging blindly at stone walls hoping for the best. This was a precise engineering operation. Those Chinese siege specialists brought counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling stone with real, terrifying precision, and the Mongols used the region's own geography as a weapon against it, damming and redirecting irrigation canals to flood Baghdad's escape routes and choke off its water supply at the same time. The Caliph, even at this late point, still hadn't fully panicked. He finally sent a cavalry force out to try to break the siege before it could properly form. That cavalry got trapped between the newly flooded canals and the waiting Mongol lines, and it was wiped out almost immediately. That single skirmish was the last real military resistance Baghdad ever managed to mount. From this point forward, it wasn't a battle anymore. It was purely a countdown clock, and Baghdad was already losing time it didn't know it had. By mid-January, the trebuchets were within range of the walls, and they simply did not stop, day or night. Stone and fire rained down without pause onto fortifications that hadn't seriously been upgraded in generations, because why would you ever upgrade walls that nobody had ever managed to breach before? Within about a week, cracks that should never have existed started spreading across a capital that had never once needed to seriously think about siege warfare. Panic, real panic, finally started spreading through the streets, markets emptying, families hiding whatever gold and manuscripts they could carry. On February the 4th, part of the eastern wall finally gave way completely, and Mongol soldiers poured through the gap into the city itself. The Caliph, watching 500 years of dynasty collapse in real time from his own palace, finally tried to negotiate a proper surrender. It was, to put it mildly, far too late. Hulagu technically accepted the surrender on paper, but by then the order to sack the city had already been set in motion, and there was no calling it back anymore. What happened over the following week is one of the single most brutal events of the entire medieval period. Mongol soldiers moved through Baghdad street by street, and the killing simply did not stop for days on end. Estimates for the death toll vary wildly depending on the source you trust, ranging from tens of thousands up to, in some more extreme medieval accounts, several 100,000 people. Whatever the real number actually was, contemporaries across multiple accounts agreed on one grim detail. The bodies filling the streets became so numerous that the smell alone reportedly became a genuine health hazard for the Mongol army itself, forcing them to relocate their own camp further away from the city walls. Not everyone died, though. Hulagu's chief wife, Dokuz Khatun, was a Nestorian Christian, and by most accounts the city's Christian quarter, along with some foreign merchants and select scholars, were deliberately spared from the slaughter. Even Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, the astronomer riding with Hulagu, reportedly managed to save a portion of the House of Wisdom's collection before the rest went into the water. A portion, not the collection. And then there was the House of Wisdom itself. Centuries of accumulated human knowledge, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, poetry, star charts, medical texts, all of it thrown straight into the Tigris River. So many manuscripts went in that later writers claimed you could walk across the river on the floating volumes without getting your feet wet, and that the water itself turned black from all the dissolving ink. Whether that specific image is literal fact or exaggerated legend passed down for effect, the underlying point still lands exactly as hard. An entire civilization's accumulated memory got drowned in a matter of days. And then, finally, there was the Caliph himself. Al-Musta'sim, the man so certain nothing could ever touch him, was captured alive inside his own palace. According to several historical accounts, the Mongols held a deep superstition against spilling royal blood directly onto open ground. So instead, he was reportedly wrapped tightly in a rolled-up carpet and trampled to death by horses. The final Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, ruler of a 500-year unbroken dynasty, killed without a single drop of his blood ever touching the earth. Some versions of the story add one more brutal detail for good measure, that Hulagu first had gold and jewels laid out in front of the Caliph and told him to eat it, mocking him for hoarding treasure instead of spending it on the army that could have actually saved his city and his life. Exaggerated for dramatic effect or not, it stands as a savage punchline to close out 5 centuries of supposedly untouchable power. So what actually died in Baghdad in February of the year 1258? Yes, a caliph wrapped in a carpet. Yes, tens of thousands of people, quite possibly far more than that. But historians often point to something even larger than the raw body count. The Islamic Golden Age, this 500-year run of scientific and cultural explosion centered almost entirely on this one city, effectively ends right here, in a matter of days. The House of Wisdom, one of the single greatest concentrations of human knowledge anywhere on the entire planet at that time, gone. Some scholars compare its loss directly to the burning of the Library of Alexandria centuries earlier, a knowledge catastrophe the region genuinely never fully recovered from. Some historians also argue the Mongols wrecked the irrigation systems feeding the region, ancient canals that had sustained agriculture there for centuries, damage that some say the local farmland never fully bounced back from, even generations later. The Abbasid Caliphate technically limped on afterward, reduced to a purely symbolic religious title under Mamluk protection down in Cairo. But the true political and cultural heart of the Islamic world had just been erased off the map in under 2 weeks. And here's the part that should really sting, more than any of the numbers. This entire catastrophe did not have to happen. Every historical account, on every side, agrees on one basic thing. The offer was real, and it was on the table the whole time. Surrender, and the city almost certainly survives, maybe humbled, maybe paying tribute for years afterward, but still standing, still full of books, still full of people who would go on to have grandchildren. One single man's absolute certainty that he was simply too important to ever lose cost an entire civilization its 500-year library and cost hundreds of thousands of people everything. Hulagu, for what it's worth, went on to found the Ilkhanate and kept pushing the campaign outward until he ran into the Mamluks a couple of years later at a place called Ain Jalut, the first real wall the supposedly unstoppable Mongol war machine had ever actually hit. It's worth sitting with how differently this could have gone. Somewhere in an alternate version of 1258, Baghdad opens its gates, pays the tribute, keeps its books, keeps its scholars, keeps its 500 years of momentum going. Historians still argue about how much of the Islamic world's scientific golden age could have kept compounding forward if the House of Wisdom simply hadn't ended up at the bottom of a river. We'll genuinely never know. What we do know is that pride, alone, without a single Mongol soldier lifting a weapon, had already lost this war weeks before the first trebuchet was even loaded. The walls didn't fail Baghdad. Its own certainty did. But that, as they say, is a story for another day.